Welcome, everybody. I'm joined by Andy Talaga, and we are here to talk about defensive shields. So, this is something that I think a lot of new and returning players get really intimidated by. I even get intimidated by defensive shields. It's adding complexity to the game. But we're here to talk about defensive shields and why they're not scary, why they help fix broken cards, and give you the 5 defensive shields that you need to know and an honorable mention. So, this is intended just to help streamline. Defensive shields are really intended to help fix broken cards at the end of the day. And
Yeah.
so let's walk through the sort of the 5 here. Andy's here once again. We're really blessed to have him on the channel.
You're welcome. So this is 5 sets. There's basically analogous cards between light side and dark side, and realistically, none of these shields really fix any egregious negative play experience cards like Sabak or Weapon Levitation or stuff. There are shields for those, but these are the kind of cards that, like, if you decide you want to dabble into open, which is actually a lot of fun to play. I've been playing a lot more of it just to try it out. There's a lot better players playing it than there are in the retro formats. No offense to my retro format people, but open players are just like on a whole nother level. And I've been playing it, and realistically, if you decide you wanted to get into it and you just have no idea where to start with shields, you get to play 4 per game roughly off of your starting effect, which is probably going to be anger, fear, aggression, knowledge, and defense. So if you stick with probably playing these cards, you get 4 of these roughly 6 cards. You're probably good for like 92%. I like to use random numbers like that. 92% of like anything you will face in open. There's a lot of corner cases, which I'm not going to get into here, and that they are covered by the other 25 defensive shields, because each side has about 30 of them now, and you can put all of them under your starting effect. So all of the like less than 10% of the time that you will need to pull a defensive shield will be covered by those other 25. So we're just going to focus on these. And basically,
so before we get into this, the way defensive shields work, right? You have a starting effect, which is different than a starting interrupt. That's what you're going to park all of your shields under, right?
Yeah. So when you play anything that has starting effects, if you're playing with only Decipher cards, it's Fear is My Ally and An Unusual Amount of Fear, and they were released in Reflections 3. They're the first cards that go onto the table. You start with your starting effect. Decipher era ones from Reflections 3, you can put up to 10 cards from outside the game, which would be defensive, and then you can play defensive shields from under them one at a time, up to 3. The Players Committee put out newer versions of starting effects, which is anger, fear, aggression, and knowledge and defense. And you can put any number of cards from outside the game under them. And 4 times per game, you can play a defensive shield. You can only play a defensive shield when you have top level action, which, I'm getting a little technical, is basically anytime you could do something that's not like a just action. So like you played an interrupt and I want to sense it, right? That's a just action. Like you couldn't play an interrupt and I'm going to respond. Like there's no response like you would have in Magic with like playing a defensive shield to counter it. Like they get an action, you get an action. They get an action, you get an action. Whenever you could take an action, you could play a defensive shield. Plays for free. You just put it onto your side of the table. So probably 90% plus, 93%, 94%, whatever you want to call it, will be covered by these 6 shields. If you're good with these 6 shields, you can go start playing open. You'll be good. The most played shield of all is definitely a tragedy has occurred and allegations of corruption. These are grabber shields. They play on table. Once per game, you can use 1 force to stack an interrupt just played here. To play a new copy of the same interrupt, your opponent has to, or you must stack it here and use +1 force for each stacked interrupt. So the other thing that I'll mention is all of these cards, except for Simple Tricks and Nonsense, are original Decipher defensive shields, and all of these cards were effects in the game. So these two were effects in the set Coruscant that were turned into defensive shields. They're just grabbers. If you're familiar in Decipher era with there will be hell to pay or what are you trying to push on us, it's basically the same text. You use a force, you stack the interrupt. Every time they want to play another copy, they have to stack it and use +1 force. It's just that you now get to basically start with it because you can use your first action of the game to go pull a defensive shield and pull a grabber. So you always have access to a grabber, which eliminates a lot of the like really abusive, I'm going to play 10 copies of this one interrupt type stuff, because you can just immediately always grab it if you need to by spending 1 force, which is great. So you've got, your grabber shield. Probably 99% of games start with each side pulling their grabber shield out. The other ones that you would want to know, battle order and battle plan. So you can play it for either player to initiate a force drain. You have to spend 3 force unless they occupy a battleground site in a battleground system. The effect that lets you initiate a battle for free, the defensive shield does not, but it otherwise is the same thing. You have to spend force. So this will eliminate, some of those, like, if your opponent's going to start force draining you, you probably want to play one of these so that they have to make the decision if they want to pay to drain. It's usually not worth it to spend 3 force to drain for 1. If you could spend 3 force to drain for 2, you'll be good. Or you could spend 3 force to drain for 3. But at that point, you're probably going to run, I'm going to skip ahead into these cards, Resistance and Ultimatum. Again, these were effects out of Jabba's Palace. Slightly different text. Play on table while you occupy at least 3 battlegrounds, or opponent occupies no battlegrounds, use no more than 2 force to each force drain or insert card. So if your opponent's going to spend 3 force to drain for 3, so long as you occupy 3 battlegrounds, which can be difficult, but it's not like terribly difficult because you already have to occupy 2 to get around force draining or not paying to force drain a system and a site. So as long as you get a 3rd, then they're capped at drains of 2, and then they have to spend 3 to drain.
So let me just jump in here and say that all of these are encouraging one interaction between players, right? They're trying to get you to interact. And 2, it's to clean up your deck. It's so your starting interrupt is not battle order and secret plans, right? Like, because I think that for so many times in retro formats, like you're the same 3 starting interrupts or starting effects rather are used. And this is cleaning up your deck and making room for other cards and more possibilities,
which will increase the likelihood that you're going to interact with your opponent, because at the end of the day, you want to be able to have a good game where you play things, your opponent play things, you battle back and forth, and you're not just both sitting there at non-battleground sites force draining with lightsabers against each other for 15 turns, right? Which is sometimes what some of the really older formats devolve into. But so there's like some anti-force drain stuff. Aim high and secret plans. They do the same thing. Play on table. If opponent is about to retrieve X force, opponent has to use X force or the retrieval is canceled. So if your opponent is going to retrieve a card, that they play something that's going to, they play first strike. So when they initiate their battle, they're going to retrieve a force. You can pull your aim high shield. Now they have to spend a force to retrieve, and then they have to pay to retrieve every single time. And sometimes you don't want to pay, or you have calculated out that you need 15 force and that's all you're going to realistically be able to pay. and that's going to get you to battle, but you're not going to have the force left to retrieve. So secret plans and aim high are usually pretty safe shield pulls. There are numerous cards that will let you retrieve a force or more than one force, so making your opponent pay for them is usually a very good option. Community Big Coward and Simple Tricks and Nonsense, again on the retrieval and paying to retrieve. Plays on table while you occupy a battleground. An opponent occupies less than 2 battlegrounds. Cancel opponent's force drains at non-battleground locations and opponent's force retrieval. And Coward is the exact same text on Dark Side. But it also cancels Asteroid Sanctuary, which is a holdover from the effect version of this card out of special edition. So really a lot of anti-retrieval, anti-force drain cards, right? You've got 2 cards that deal with anti-retrieval and 3 cards ultimately that are dealing with anti-force drain, or making it so force draining is not the sole strategy to win the game. And those are probably, if you play 4 of these 5 cards, I would say most of the time you're probably going to pull like your Grabber, Coward, Secret Plans, Battle Order. If your opponent pulls Battle Order, you don't have to play your Battle Order because it affects both players. But and then you could pull like a different shield. But realistically, if you stick with like these 4 from, Tragedy Has Occurred through Simple Tricks and Nonsense, that's going to cover almost everything you're probably going to want to do in a game with defensive shields. Again, lots of corner cases. Ultimatum and Resistance are probably a little bit less likely to be pulled, but they're still really good to think about because there are times where, lightsabers still add to force drain. So you're at a drain 2 site. Now it's going to be a 3, or you're at a system that drains for 3, like Kessel or something, right? You're still going to want to be able to cap that at some point. So you kind of want to think about those. And then my honorable mentions are Do or No Not and There Is No Try. To play on table, Sense and Alter are now lost interrupts. Whenever opponent makes a destiny draw for Sense or Alter and it is successful, they lose 2 force. Again, just straight ports of the effect versions out of Dagobah. I put them as honorable mentions. Not every deck plays Sense and Alter. Alter is almost really never played. Sense still does get played. It's usually like 1 copy in a deck, if that, especially if you have a lot of Jedis running around or the Emperor or something. It's probably safe to assume that your opponent has a copy of Sense. They may not, because they know that they could just run into the shield whenever. There are still a lot of really great interrupts, and the Players Committee has put out even more really great interrupts that you want to play. So sometimes playing a copy of Sense makes a lot of sense. We'll call it a pun. So you could run into if your opponent's playing, Hunt Down or Bring Him Before Me, and they get out Vader or the Emperor, they might have a Sense. You might consider putting out Do or Do Not. There Is No Try, just to proactively be like, hey, don't sense my stuff because you're going to lose force doing it. So that's kind of my honorable mention. Not every deck's going to run. If you're playing against ISB or Court of the Vile Gangster or something, they probably don't have Sense. So you wouldn't necessarily run into it. But yeah, your Grabber, Battle Order, Secret Plans, Coward, Simple Tricks are probably your end all be all of defensive shields. And then, 500 corner cases are covered on the other 25 shields.
So the one that I think we'll close out here, and I'll just say this, that I think that the 25 other shields, they're all there sort of as bluffs. No one's going to run inserts because they know there's a shield for it, right? And so effectively, they act as de facto bans of the cards, because people are like, well, I'm not going to build a deck around inserts or around Asteroid Sanctuary because I know that they'll pull this shield. And so because of that bluff, people just aren't going to waste the deck space on it. So that's also an impact that defensive shields have, is they get rid of a lot more abusive strategies. I mean, if you've ever played against an insert deck, like a true insert deck in Retro, it is miserable. It is like such an unfun experience.
Or like pod racing, right? Like your pod racing is starting or an interrupt. So like when you set up the game, you're pod racing. Your opponent knows you're pod racing. There's a shield that just like your opponent, you don't lose force, your opponent doesn't retrieve any force. So it's like, what's really the point of pod racing then?
Yeah,
like,
right.
It just kind of like shuts down pod racing, and you're like, I'm okay with that because pod racing's kind of BS.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I think that's the takeaway I want with folks. This adds complexity to the game, but it also, frankly, acts as a ban or sort of improves a lot of the bad gameplay experiences that I think a lot of people have. And as I play more Retro, I'm just like, oh, that is such an annoying mechanism. Like I wish that they weren't allowed to do that. I wish that Premier to Hoth, wasn't just like 12 copies of Alter, Innovate or whatever. Like,
and shields kind of solve all that stuff. So if you play a format and you're just like, wow, Revolution is just such an annoying card to play against, or Beggar, or Frozen Assets, or Ice Storm, or any of these like really abusive cards, they're all shielded. You go play Open. I'm not saying you're never going to run into somebody who's playing Revolution. Somebody might like sneak one into their deck so that, if you've already played all 4 of your shields, then they can Revolution something. It happens, but like it's the rare exception to the rule.
Right. Okay. Well, Andy, this has been our primer on shields. We're going to probably do a little bit more open content as we creep our way there, but this is probably the first thing you need to think about if you want to get into open is defensive shields. It's going to nullify a lot of strategies. Most of them were abusive strategies, and it's a good thing. So hopefully it was useful. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I should have said the front end, but it doesn't really matter. I don't really care at this point. If you want to subscribe, do it. It doesn't matter to me.
Ring the bell.
But thanks for tuning in, everybody, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks.